They kidnapped her daughter and set fire to the barn, but a man with no past rode before sundown. The first light of morning stretched its fingers across the Cimarron Valley, painting the land in muted gold and crimson. Dust hung in the still air, not yet stirred by the wind. A thin line of smoke rose on the horizon, black against the pale sky, twisting as it climbed. Crows circled above the source, their cries sharp and insistent, warning or witness, no one could say. Clara Danvers stood barefoot in the doorway of her small ranch house, the wooden floor beneath her feet still cool from the night. Her eyes, sun-weathered and sharp from years of watching the land, locked onto the dark pillar rising from behind the eastern rise. She didn't need to guess. Her bones told her something was wrong before her mind caught up. The barn. She ran. Across the brittle grass and packed dirt, past the empty troughs and splintered fence rails. Smoke grew thicker, biting her throat before she even saw the flames. The barn was nearly gone by the time she reached it. Nothing but skeletal beams and the last stubborn gasps of fire gnawing at blackened timber. Heat shimmered off the ground. The acrid scent of burned hay and singed leather clung to the air. Her breath caught, not from running, but from what she didn't see. "Emma," she called out. Silence. She circled the barn, her voice rising, panic bleeding through. "Emma." A charred saddle lay half buried in ash. One of the cows was down, its hide blistered, unmoving. The others were gone, fled, stolen, or worse. Clara staggered toward the scorched wall, where the fire hadn't reached. Something was carved there. Deep gouges in the wood, crude and deliberate. A jagged W. Clara stared at it, the shape punching the air from her lungs. Wexler. The name felt like grit in her mouth. Her daughter was gone. The scream that came from her didn't sound human. It tore up her throat and scattered the crows. She dropped to her knees, clutching a handful of earth, and swore into it. By the time she saddled the mare, the sun had cleared the hills and the heat had started to rise. Dust kicked up in her wake as she rode hard into town, skirts whipping behind her, eyes fierce with fear. She didn't stop to breathe until she pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. Inside, Sheriff Horton looked up from his desk, startled by the slam of the door. "They've taken her," Clara said. "Emma. The Wexler gang. They burned the barn." The sheriff's face tightened. He rose slowly. "Clara, you sure it was them?" She pointed. "They left their damn mark. She's gone." "I'm sorry," he said, "but that gang, those boys aren't just trouble. They're killers. I ain't got the men or the firepower to chase him. I'm not asking for a war. I'm asking for my daughter. And I'm telling you," he said, lowering his voice, "you won't get her back by riding straight into Black Rock. So that's it." Her voice cracked. "You're leaving her to them?" He didn't answer. Clara turned and stormed out, fury pounding behind her ribs. People watched from porches and windows as she stalked across Main Street, dust clinging to her hem. No one stepped forward. They all knew what the Wexler gang did to folks who crossed them. They remembered the charred remains of old Thompson's place. They remembered the cries. She stopped at the edge of town, unsure where to turn next, when she saw him. He was sitting alone beneath the awning of the old feed store, hat tilted low, a thin trail of smoke curling from the roll-your-own between his fingers. His coat was dusty, boots worn, face half-shadowed. His horse stood tethered nearby, a gray gelding with a limp in one leg and a saddle older than the building beside it. He didn't look up when she approached, not until her shadow crossed his boots. "I need a rider," she said, voice hoarse. The man took one last drag, then stubbed out the cigarette on his boot heel. When he raised his head, his eyes were a shade too pale for comfort, like winter sky before a storm. "What for?" he asked, quiet and steady. "They took my daughter." He studied her a moment longer. "Wexler." She nodded. He didn't ask any more questions. Behind them, the sheriff's door creaked open. "You don't want to get involved, stranger," Horton called. "You don't know what kind of hell they'll bring down." The man rose. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone who never wasted energy. He stepped off the porch and reached for his saddle. "I'll ride," he said, not to the sheriff, but to Clara. "Before sundown." He mounted in one motion and turned the horse westward, as if he already knew where the trail began. Clara stared after him, her breath held in her chest. The sheriff muttered something under his breath and walked back inside. The townsfolk didn't follow. They didn't ask the man's name. They just watched the dust trail fade behind him. No one knew who he was or where he came from. Some said he was a deserter. Others whispered about bounty work or blood debts too deep to settle. But that morning, before the heat climbed high and the wind found its voice, the valley held its breath, because a man with no past had ridden toward fire, and somewhere beyond the ridge a child waited. No one knew his name, but that morning, before the heat rose high, the wind carried a promise, the kind that ends in blood or redemption. They rode east, where the land stretched lean and bone-dry beneath the weight of a rising sun. The stranger led, scanning the dirt and stone like a man reading an old language. Faint hoof prints crossed the brittle crust, soft as a whisper, almost erased by wind. Yet he followed them unerring, weaving between sagebrush and down into the gulches carved by centuries of forgotten storms. Clara Danvers trailed a few lengths behind, her mare panting with the pace. The air tasted of grit and sweat, the silence broken only by the clink of tack and the distant cry of hawks circling high above. She hadn't asked permission to ride along. When he turned to look at her before leaving the edge of town, she simply saddled up. He didn't object. That was enough. "Got a name?" she asked once, near a dry wash where mesquite thorns clawed at her skirt. He didn't look back. "Don't need one." "Well," she said, wiping sweat from her brow, "I'll call you Traveler then. Seems to suit you." He made no comment, but she thought the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. They moved steadily through the morning, across high ridges where buzzards watched and down into ravines that smelled of old water and rust. Clara's gaze stayed alert, eyes trained from years of ranch life, watching cattle, fixing fences, waiting for trouble. Now trouble had come, and she followed it into the teeth of the desert. Her mind drifted as they rode. She saw her husband again, Daniel, tall, broad, always with a laugh at the ready. A cavalryman, stationed near Fort Craig when they met. When the war ended, he brought her west with promises of land and peace. Then came the whispers. Desertion. Gold gone missing. Disgrace. He vanished one night, leaving behind a child too young to understand and a wife who couldn't afford to care what anyone thought. The last thing he ever said to her had come on a rain-soaked morning, long before the storms dried up for good. "If trouble comes, ride west," he'd said, gripping her hand hard. "Trust the quiet man." She hadn't understood it then. She did now. Just past noon, they came upon a body. Clara saw the buzzards first, then the faint shimmer of something unnatural in the sage, fabric maybe. Traveler dismounted and approached, gun drawn, steps slow and silent. It was a ranch hand, young, maybe 20, face sunburned and blood crusted around his temple. He lay half-curled beneath a scrub bush, clutching his side, breath shallow. His eyes flicked open at their approach. "They took her," he rasped. Clara dropped beside him, canteen in hand. "Emma." "The girl." He nodded weakly. "East. Black Rock. They got plans, big money." "What kind of plans?" she asked. But his gaze had shifted to Traveler, and something like dread passed through it. "They know," he whispered. "They know you're coming to—" With a shudder, he went still. The desert reclaimed its silence. Traveler stood without a word and turned back to his horse. Clara followed, jaw tight. "What does that mean?" "They know you're coming." He adjusted his saddle, not looking at her. "Means we don't have time to waste." By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of hammered copper. A hot wind rose from the south, sweeping sand along the trail. They were cutting through a narrow ravine when Traveler raised a hand and stopped. He scanned the cliffs, then whispered, "We're being watched." Clara followed his gaze. Two silhouettes moved among the rocks above. "Scouts," he said. "Wexlers." Before she could answer, a shot rang out. A bullet chipped stone inches from her head. She flinched, ducking behind her horse. Traveler had already drawn and fired once. One of the scouts dropped from the ridge with a cry, landing hard and motionless. The second tried to flee. Clara didn't think. She raised the rifle from her saddlebag, braced it against a stone, and squeezed the trigger. He fell like a sack of flour. She stared at the smoking barrel, breathing hard. Traveler glanced at her, and for the first time, there was something like surprise in his eyes. "I didn't have time to miss," she muttered, lowering the rifle. He gave her a slow nod of respect. "Good shot." They checked the bodies quickly. Neither carried much, but one had a crude map with a route marked to Black Rock Canyon. Traveler studied it for a moment, then burned it in a strip of dry grass. They rode on in silence, the wind stronger now, kicking grit into their faces. Clara kept her eyes on the stranger ahead, watching how he moved in the saddle, how his hands never fidgeted, how he never looked twice to find his footing. A man didn't get that way from herding cattle. "Military?" she asked finally. He didn't answer, but when the wind quieted, she heard him humming under his breath. It was an old marching tune, faint but steady. The sun sagged lower as they crested a ridge and saw the canyon sprawl before them in the fading light, dark and jagged, like a wound in the land. Shadows stretched long across the rocks. Somewhere out there, Emma waited. Somewhere, men with guns and worse waited too. Clara looked over at the man beside her. The traveler, a stranger with no name, no past, and the kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from things that had gone unsaid too long. They'd started that morning as two desperate riders chasing smoke. By nightfall, the land knew them as one storm, rolling silent toward the Black Rock. Black Rock Canyon carved its way through the desert like a scar, jagged and unforgiving. The rock walls rose steep and sheer, rust-red with streaks of soot from 1,000 old fires. Wind funneled through the narrow throat of the ravine, howling like wolves that had lost their pack, shrill and mournful. In the fading light, shadows stretched long across the ground, clawing their way toward the canyon's heart like fingers of something ancient and hungry. From a ledge above the northern rim, Clara Danvers knelt beside the traveler, peering through a spyglass. Smoke from their small campfire drifted low, too faint to be seen from below. She tracked movement around the canyon's floor, for men gathered near a lean-to, rifles slung. Beyond them, tucked against the stone wall, stood a haphazard structure of scrap iron and warped timber. A cage. Inside, a small figure sat curled, arms around her knees. Emma. Clara's hand tightened around the glass until her knuckles whitened. "I count 8 total," she said. "Maybe more inside." Traveler nodded without looking up. His gaze swept the terrain like it was a map he'd drawn himself. "They've got the high ground behind the main fire pit," he said. "Makes sense, easy to defend, hard to surprise. But there's a service trail that runs east around the bluff. Rockfall's covered most of it, but I can make it down quiet. That cage has no lock, just a wedge bar." Clara turned to him. "Then we go now." "No," he said. She stared. "Why the hell not?" "They're too awake, watching everything. We wait until moonrise, when eyes start to blur and bellies are full. And Emma, she's alive. That's what matters." Clara forced herself to breathe. Down below, her daughter didn't cry or scream, just sat still waiting. Brave like her father, who'd vanished 2 years ago and left her with a promise instead of protection. Clara looked back at the traveler. "You've been here before," she said. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled a long, slender knife. He walked to the canyon wall behind them and scraped something into the sandstone. Clara stood to see. A circle. Inside it, crossed sabers. Cavalry. He stared at the mark for a long time, jaw tight. "This place," he said quietly, "was once a field station during the war. A lot of men went into this canyon. Not all of them came out." Clara said nothing. The wind howled again, stronger now, as if echoing the ghosts beneath their feet. At moonrise, the canyon dimmed to silver and shadow. Traveler donned a dark oilskin and adjusted the leather strap around his holster. Clara crouched by the brush pile she'd stacked earlier, flint in hand. "When you see the smoke," he said, "give me 5 minutes. Then go for the ridge. Stay sharp." "You too," she said. "You come back with her, or don't come back at all." His eyes met hers, still and steady. "Understood." Then he disappeared. He moved through the brush like mist, keeping to the gullies and shadows. Stones never shifted under his boots. His breath matched the wind. He skirted past the lower watchman, waited for the patrol's lazy turn, and slipped behind the lean-to with surgical precision. One guard leaned against a rock, half-dozing. The traveler drew his knife, quick and quiet, and the man slumped without a sound. Closer now. He could see the cage. Emma sat with her chin on her knees, eyes half-lidded. Traveler crouched beside the bars and whispered, "Emma." She jerked upright, gasping. "You, who are you?" "Your father sent me." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed strong. "He's dead." "No," Traveler said. "He's the reason I'm here." He reached through the bars, lifted the wedge, and eased the door open. "Come quiet. We've got to move." Before she could step out, a voice rang out across the camp. A cry. "Hey!" Traveler grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her close as shouts erupted. He ran low, weaving between tents, pistol drawn. Behind them, men spilled out of shadows with torches and guns. On the ridge, Clara struck flint to brush. The fire caught fast, dry as the land itself. Smoke surged upward, thick and black. She shouldered her rifle and aimed. Below, Traveler and Emma ran toward the narrow pass near the ridge. A shot cracked. He shoved the girl down and returned fire, dropping one man instantly. A second fired from behind a barrel. Clara's rifle barked. His shoulder snapped back as the bullet struck home. The outlaw crumpled. Traveler winced, clutching his left shoulder, but kept moving. Another gunman raised his rifle to fire at Emma. Clara didn't think. She fired again. Her bullet split the night. By the time the outlaws reached the blaze at the ridge, the girl was gone, and so was the man who'd taken her. Back at the top of the canyon, Clara met them as they scrambled over the rocks. Emma collapsed into her mother's arms, shaking. Clara clutched her tight, pressing kisses into her hair. Traveler leaned against the stone, breathing hard. Blood soaked his sleeve, but he stayed upright. "You're hurt," Clara said. "Later," he rasped. They didn't stop moving until the canyon mouth was far behind them, and the only light was the pale smudge of dawn stretching across the desert sky. Blood marked the stone, but the girl was free. The price had only begun to be paid. They reached the ruins of the old mission just before sunrise. It stood atop a low bluff overlooking the desert floor, walls crumbled by time and wind, yet still solid enough to serve. Stone arches cast long shadows over the sand, and what remained of the chapel roof was open to the sky, a single beam still bearing the scorched brand of fire from years gone by. Clara helped the traveler down from his horse. His face was pale, jaw tight from pain, left sleeve soaked through with blood. Emma clung to Clara's side, her small frame trembling though she said nothing. The girl hadn't made a sound since the escape. Inside the mission's old sacristy, now no more than a corner of stone and earth, Clara laid him on a blanket. She cut the fabric from his shoulder, revealing the wound. Clean through the meat of the arm, just above the bicep. Ugly, but not deadly. "You're lucky," she muttered, tearing strips of cloth for bandages. He didn't flinch. "I usually am." "You're also quiet. Too damn quiet." She poured whiskey over the wound. He hissed through clenched teeth, but didn't pull away. Clara cleaned and wrapped it as best she could, hand steady even as her mind boiled with questions. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and stared down at him. "No more riddles," she said. "No more silence. Who are you really?" He watched her for a long moment. Then he sat up slowly, using the wall for support. "Name's Caleb Wardell," he said. "Used to be Major, U.S. Cavalry. Fort Craig." Clara blinked. That name, faintly familiar, like a storm you'd heard of but never seen. "They said he was dead," she said slowly. "Wardell was court-martialed, deserted under fire." "That's part true," he replied, "but not all." He reached into his coat and pulled out a tarnished badge. Not a lawman's star, something older. A military insignia, bent at one corner, still bearing the etching of crossed sabers and a number beneath. 3rd Cavalry. "I was given orders to burn a native settlement near the Pecos," he said. "Men, women, children. Said it was retaliation. said it was justice. I said no. Clara didn't speak. I was relieved of command. But the orders stood. The men went anyway. Some followed. Others stayed behind, like your husband. Clara's heart slammed in her chest. Daniel, she breathed. He didn't desert, Wardell said. He stayed to hold off a group of rogue scouts who'd broken from the ranks. Gave the others a chance to pull out. I ran into him later, half dead. He gave me names, yours, Emma's. Said if anything happened to him, I was to make sure you were looked after. That was 2 years ago. She shook her head, eyes glistening. He never came home. They said he ran from his duty. He didn't. Wardell's voice lowered. I did. The words hung between them, like smoke in a cold room. Emma had crept closer during the talk, and now sat quietly beside her mother, listening with wide eyes. Clara touched the girl's hair, but didn't take her eyes off Wardell. So why the silence? She asked. Because a name like mine brings attention. Wrong kind. There's still folk out there who'd shoot me on sight, court-martial or no. You've been drifting ever since, she said. Helping where you can. Keeping promises. He nodded once. It doesn't make up for what I let happen, but it's all I've got. Clara looked away, staring at the cracked floor. Her throat tightened. The weight of her husband's memory, long buried beneath lies, lifted just enough to let in something like peace. She had carried the shame of desertion for 2 years. Now it was dust in the wind. I thought I needed justice, she said softly. Turns out I just needed the truth. Wardell leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. Truth's never clean, but yours now. The morning sun climbed slow and heavy over the canyon's edge. In the distance, dust rose thin, but growing. A rider. Then another. The Wexler gang wasn't done. Clara stood, steel in her spine. They'll come for her, she said. For all of us. Wardell opened his eyes. They will. We're not running. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker behind his eyes. Approval, maybe even pride. Good, he said. Then we fight smart. Together, they scouted the grounds. The mission's thick walls offered cover, and narrow corridors through the ruins gave them choke points. Clara set traps, wire snags, broken glass at entrances. Emma helped in quiet determination, laying rocks in a pattern Wardell showed her to mark blind spots. As they worked, Clara felt something shift deep inside her. Not fear, not rage, something cleaner. She wasn't helpless anymore. She wasn't just a widow or a rancher clinging to what was left. She was standing on sacred ground, ready to defend what mattered. By dusk, the ruins were ready. Wardell sat near the old altar, cleaning his revolver, his arm now in a crude sling. Clara sat beside him. Emma curled in a blanket nearby, finally asleep. We may not get out of this, she said. No, he agreed. But she might. Clara looked toward her daughter, then back to the man with no past. She called you a ghost, she said. Maybe you are. Wardell glanced at the shadows crawling across the floor. Ghosts don't bleed, he replied. They just come back to finish what the living never could. Outside, the wind picked up. The last light died on the horizon, and in the distance, the riders came. The sun dipped low over the rim of the horizon, casting the world in shades of bronze and blood. The ruins of the old mission stood like the bones of some ancient beast, weathered and still, its broken bell tower watching the desert like a sentinel. Wind stirred the dust across the courtyard. The silence before violence was complete. Then came the riders, 12 men in a line, their silhouettes sharp against the setting sun, dust rising behind them like a storm. At their head rode Jed Wexler, wide-brimmed hat low, coat flapping like wings. He held his reins with one hand and a shotgun across his lap with the other. His face bore the grin of a man certain of his power. Inside the mission, Clara knelt in the shadows, rifle trained through a slit in the stone. Emma crouched beside her, hands on the ammunition box. Wardell sat just beyond the altar, arm in a sling, pistol resting across his knee. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes were locked ahead, cold and steady. The gang dismounted with casual arrogance, laughing as they spread out. They thought it would be easy. One wounded man, a widow, a child, an old ruin, and a last stand. They didn't see the wire until the first man tripped it. The explosion wasn't large, just enough to send shrapnel through a man's legs. He went down screaming. Chaos followed, shouts, scrambling, curses thrown to the sky. The trap snapped to life like fangs, broken glass at entry points, stones falling from ledges. A second man bled out in seconds. Clara fired first. Her bullet took a man through the collarbone, spinning him backward. The others took cover, confused, returning fire in a panic. Wardell moved like a ghost through the shadows. He stepped from behind a crumbled pillar and dropped a man with a single shot to the heart. His left arm hung useless at his side, but he never missed. Emma handed her mother cartridges, with shaking hands, her lips pressed in a hard line. Clara kissed her forehead once between shots. "Just like we practiced," she whispered. A gang member rushed the bell tower. Clara took him through the thigh before he reached the first step. Wardell ducked behind a stone column as bullets cracked overhead. He waited, counted, then stepped out and fired again. Another man dropped. 6 left. They circled the ruins now, looking for weakness. One of them hurled a bottle of fire. Flames bloomed against the outer wall, sending smoke curling into the dusk. Shadows danced in the ruins' hollow frame. And then Wexler himself stepped forward. "Wardell!" he bellowed, voice thick with venom. "Didn't they hang you already?" Wardell stepped into view, gun lowered. "Guess the rope slipped." Wexler laughed. "I ought to thank you. Your fall made space for men like me." "No," Wardell said. "Men like you were always there. I just stopped looking the other way." The two faced off in the courtyard, 10 paces apart. The air hung still, waiting. Clara held her fire. This wasn't her moment. It was his. Wexler smirked. "You're gonna die with a coward's name. Deserter. Traitor." Wardell's grip on the revolver tightened. "And you'll die without one." It happened in a blink. Wexler drew first, but too wide, too wild. Wardell didn't flinch. One shot. Center mass. Wexler staggered, blood blooming on his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. He fell to his knees, then to the dust. Behind him, the last of the gang broke and ran. Wardell exhaled, then crumpled to the ground. Clara screamed his name and ran to him, dropping beside his body. Blood soaked the front of his shirt, but he was breathing barely. Townsfolk arrived just before full dark, riding hard. Horton at the front, wide-eyed at the smoke and silence. Guns drawn, they expected horror. What they found was the Wexler gang dead or scattered, Clara with a rifle in her lap, and Wardell unconscious but alive. "Lord above!" someone whispered. They did it. No one spoke of cowardice again. They built fires through the night. The townsmen buried the dead, bound the wounded, and took account of what had happened. Clara stood by Emma's side, one hand resting on the girl's shoulder, the other holding Wardell's badge. By morning, Wardell was gone. His bedroll was neatly folded. The sling and bloodied shirt were left behind. No tracks led out from the ruins, only a folded scrap of parchment under a smooth stone. Clara opened it slowly. Asterisk, no name worth remembering. Just a promise kept, asterisk. She held the note for a long time, then folded it again and slipped it into her coat. Weeks passed. The mission was never rebuilt, but the town remembered. They spoke of the woman who stood her ground, and the stranger who walked into fire without a name. And somewhere west of Cimarron, riders sometimes swore they saw a gray horse passing through the dust, its rider tall and silent beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They say a man with no past rode west again, his story trailing in silence behind him. But on one ranch, under a wide sky, a mother and daughter lived free, because he rode before sundown.